CBSN political reporter Caitlin Huey-Burns joins me now with more. Caitlin, I want to start off with a bit of breaking news here. The New York Times is reporting that former Massachusetts Governor Deval Patrick is considering running for president in 2020. I know, obviously, this is just breaking as you literally walked out here onto this set, but this is already an extremely crowded field. This comes, as we see here, as part of the New York Times story notes, just days after Michael Bloomberg took steps to enter the 2020 race, potentially. This is an unexpected development, to say the least.
It's kind of this like one in, one out policy. Yeah. Apparently Democrats have, but O'Rourke drops out. You have two more candidates considering it. Right. I will say, though, when you look at polling, it shows that voters are mostly satisfied with the candidates that they have. And when you talk to voters on the ground, they say that they're overwhelmed by the number of candidates, that there are too many, that they're waiting for this field to narrow, that they're trying to make this decision. What this does signal, though, is that there are some in the Democratic Party who are upset with the current field or see weaknesses in the frontrunners right now. So you've seen the criticisms of Joe Biden leading nationally but lagging in the early states, Iowa, New Hampshire, Elizabeth Warren gaining ground but raising some concerns among some Democrats about whether she can defeat Donald Trump, and other candidates have perceived vulnerabilities as well. But it does raise the question about, you look at this field, it's the most diverse field that the Democrats have ever had. The talent pool is vast. You've had some candidates who have floundered, perhaps unexpectedly, but nonetheless. There begs this question of what makes you think that you would be different, or what can you inject into this race that isn't there already. For Bloomberg, it was maybe a more moderate approach, seeking some advantage there. For Deval Patrick, this is just developing, so we're awaiting confirmation of what he is thinking.
Yeah, so we'll continue to keep an eye on that. I want to ask you about this poll out from New Hampshire today. So Quinnipiac University found a really tight race at the top in the Granite State, with Joe Biden leading, but only 38% of those likely voters have their minds made up. When you break it down, Bernie Sanders is the only candidate with a majority of supporters who have their minds made up at this point. So what should we take away from that?
Well, that's a theme that we've been seeing with Bernie Sanders supporters, that in New Hampshire and other polls in Iowa, for example, that his supporters are decided about him. And so that shows a strong base, a strong constituency for him. Then you look at the other candidates, and there is room for movement. And that's why when you ask about some of these lower tier candidates, why they're staying in the race, a lot of their campaigns say that, look, we can kind of fly under the radar a little bit and try to convince the persuadable voters that are out there. You see that in polling, and again, in talking to voters have kind of started to narrow down their choices, but they aren't exactly firm yet. Even when you talk to voters that are, at a Pete Buttigieg event or at an Elizabeth Warren event, they seem committed, but sometimes could say they're open to making a decision, and they want to see the rest of it play out. So that is something to look for in these polls, the undecided numbers.
So New Hampshire Democrats were also asked if they would consider voting for former New York City Mayor Michael Bloomberg. 54% say they would definitely not vote for Bloomberg, compared to 37% considering it, and 2% who say they definitely will. Now, it's interesting, though, we should note, because we're not sure if they were asked about other specific candidates in the same vein, so hard to know what exactly that might mean. Yeah. Nevertheless, should the Bloomberg team be concerned at all about that?
Well, I think when you look at some of these candidates who have been doing well, they've been in it for a long time. I mean, Elizabeth Warren was the first to announce on New Year's Eve. It does raise the question of what your constituency would be, how you would form a coalition if you don't already have a national or known base of support going into this. So for Bloomberg, while he has some national name ID, he certainly has enough money to compete and to possibly build an organization. But what is his constituency? I think that remains to be seen. He's been talking about, or his spokesman has talked about, some perceived weaknesses maybe in the Biden camp, but how you would actually cultivate that support, especially if you are self-funding and not making the debate stage. That's a big question too. So you have to get a certain number of donors and some support in polls to make that stage, and we've seen that have a winnowing effect.
So we know that voters in New Hampshire as well as Iowa take their first in the nation primary and caucus status very, very seriously, but former Housing and Urban Development Secretary Castro is arguing that the order should change because the electorate in both Iowa and New Hampshire are more than 90% white. Let's go ahead and play that clip.
I actually believe that that we do need to change the order of the states, because I don't believe that that we're the same country we were in 1972. That's when Iowa first held its caucus first. And by the time we have the next presidential election in 2024, it'll have been more than 50 years since 1972. Our country has changed a lot in those 50 years. The Democratic Party has changed a lot. Demographically, it's not reflective of the United States as a whole, certainly not reflective of the Democratic Party, and I believe that other states should have their chance.
So this all began after Elizabeth Warren dismissed this idea at a forum over the weekend. But why does she not like the concept, and what do other candidates think about it?
Well, Elizabeth Warren said that, look, she's playing by the rules that are here now. And, she is in the lead in some polls in Iowa and New Hampshire. So she has reason to not criticize openly.
It's working out for her right now.
But this does come as Democrats are talking about access to democracy, voting rights, and issues surrounding the vote. But they have not really talked about what Julian Castro is talking about, which is an interesting dynamic because they have to kind of compete in this arena. I actually asked Pete Buttigieg about this last week in an interview, whether he was concerned about the idea of Iowa going first, whether that's fair. I think we have a clip. Here in Iowa, we're looking at the crowds that you're getting and some other candidates are getting, and it's mostly white audiences. Are you concerned about that Iowa goes first in the process? So that's kind of the focus.
Well, I think it's a really healthy thing that we are competing in very different early states. Iowa for sure, New Hampshire, also South Carolina and Nevada, which are very different from each other. And I think it's important in order to succeed to continue competing in different states with many different characteristics, different makeup, but also a lot of issues are the same. The issues that I'm hearing from rural black voters in South Carolina worried about education and healthcare are not that different from the issues that I'm hearing from rural white voters and city dwellers in a place like Iowa.
So you hear him there saying, whoa, wait, Nevada and South Carolina are in this too, but that does not really illustrate the fact that Iowa and New Hampshire play such a critical role in winnowing the field and establishing that momentum to head to those other states. But then you look at a candidacy like Joe Biden. He's lagging in Iowa and New Hampshire, but he does really well, especially among African-American voters in a state like South Carolina. And that's kind of what's propelling him at this stage. And that's why you hear from the campaign at times, we don't always have to win the early states, but we need to do well in South Carolina. That's kind of the saving grace. So that's a dynamic here, and Democrats will tell you that you cannot win the nomination without a diverse coalition, and that in order to gain that support, you have to compete in states that are more reflective of the Democratic Party at large. Also hard to do that while playing by these rules.
Absolutely. All right. Caitlin Huey-Burns for us. Caitlin, thank you very much.
Thank you.